My name is Evelyn Marsh, and for 19 years my only daughter let her husband convince her I was the reason their lives weren't perfect. She didn't do it all at once. That's the thing nobody tells you about being slowly erased by someone you love. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens in small cuts. A holiday invitation that gets lost. A grandchild's birthday you find out about 3 days after it passed. A phone call where she sounds like she's reading from a script someone else wrote. And then one morning you wake up and realize the script has been running so long she's forgotten it isn't her own voice anymore. I was sitting in my sunroom when she called. Not a broom closet, not a rented room with a broken radiator, but a real sunroom with big windows that look out over the yard I finally own outright, the one with the magnolia tree I planted the spring. I turned 62. My coffee was hot. The morning light was the good kind, that pale gold that only happens in October in Georgia. When my phone buzzed and I saw her name, something tightened in my chest, the way it always does. Not dread exactly, more like bracing. Mum. Not Mama, the way she used to say it when she was small and came padding into my room after a nightmare. Just Mum, the way you'd address a form. She was calling to tell me about the party. Her husband's 40th birthday. Big celebration, she said. Rented out a venue downtown. Catered. Live music. She and her husband. I'll call him by what he was to me for most of those 19 years, which is a stranger wearing my son-in-law's face. Had invited everyone, his family, their friends, colleagues from his firm. And then she paused in that particular way that meant she was about to say something she'd rehearsed. "We'd love for you to come," she said. She laughed a little, the way people laugh when something isn't funny. "It would be nice for people to finally meet you. He's always told everyone so much about you." I knew what that meant. I had spent 19 years learning the language of that household, learning what the pauses meant and what the laughs that weren't laughs meant. He had told people things about me, all right. I knew exactly what kind of things. "I'll be there," I said. And I hung up before she could hear my voice change. I sat there for a long time after that call, my coffee going cold, the magnolia tree doing nothing in particular outside the window. My son-in-law wanted me in that room so the people he'd spent years talking to about me could finally put a face to the story. He wanted them to see a woman who looked like what he'd described. Worn down, small, grateful for the invitation. He had no idea who I'd become. But to understand why he hated me, why he'd spent the better part of 2 decades working to make my daughter see me as the enemy, I have to take you back to when none of this had happened yet. Back to when I was just Beverly's mother, and that was the most important thing in the world to me. I had Beverly when I was 26. Her father and I were never married. He was kind enough when he was present, and absent enough that his kindness didn't much matter. By the time Beverly was 3, it was the two of us, and I was working 2 jobs, a day shift at a medical billing office and evenings at a diner on Route 9, and I was doing it without complaint because Beverly was the whole point of everything. She was a serious little girl with her father's eyes and my stubbornness, and she worked hard at everything she touched. I made sure of that. We didn't have much, but we had standards, and I held her to them, and she held herself to them too, and by the time she was grown she had a full scholarship to Georgia State and a future that looked like everything I'd scraped and saved and gone without to give her. I liked her husband when I first met him. That's the part that still sits with me sometimes. The fact that I liked him. He was handsome and polished, and he made Beverly laugh in a way I hadn't seen in a while. He had a good job, financial consulting, wore nice shoes, remembered my birthday the first 2 years. I thought Beverly had found something solid. What I didn't see, not at first, was the way he listened when I was talking. Not to what I was saying, but for something to use. I didn't see the way he'd repeat things back to Beverly later with just enough twist to make them sound like criticism. I didn't see how over months and then years he was quietly, methodically building a version of me in my daughter's mind that had very little to do with who I actually was. The first time I noticed, Beverly had just had their son. My grandson was 6 weeks old, and I had driven up from Macon to help for a week, the way mothers do. I cooked and cleaned and held that baby through the 3 a.m. screaming so Beverly could sleep. On the last night, my son-in-law came into the kitchen while I was washing bottles and said, very pleasantly, that Beverly found my visits stressful, that she needed space, that he was sure I understood. I stood there with my hands in soapy water and I thought, this man just told me, in my daughter's house, after a week of me running myself into the ground to help them, that I was a burden. And he did it so pleasantly. That was the thing about him. He was always pleasant. I didn't say anything. I dried my hands and I went to bed, and the next morning I kissed my daughter and my grandson goodbye, and I drove back to Macon and I cried the whole way down I-75. And I told myself it was just adjustment. New parents were overwhelmed. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. But then the holidays started getting complicated. Then Beverly stopped calling as often. Then there was the year my grandson started school, and I found out from a cousin who ran into them at a restaurant that there had been a back-to-school night and nobody had told me. And when I called Beverly, she sounded confused, like she wasn't sure why I thought I would have been invited. He told her, she said, that I had mentioned I was busy that week. I hadn't mentioned anything. I hadn't spoken to either of them in 3 weeks. That was when I understood. This wasn't adjustment. This wasn't new parent stress. This was a campaign, slow and patient and deliberate, and it had been running since before I knew to look for it. The hardest part wasn't the exclusions. It was what they did to Beverly's memory of me. Over those years, things I'd said got repeated back to me in shapes I didn't recognize. A comment I'd made about Beverly's apartment. I'd said the kitchen was small, which was just a fact. I wasn't criticizing, I was making conversation. Became, in the retelling, me calling their home inadequate. A question I asked once about his salary, the normal kind of question a mother asks when her daughter is talking about buying a house, became me trying to control their finances. I started to feel like I was standing in front of a mirror that showed someone I'd never been, and my daughter had been looking at that mirror for so long she'd stopped checking whether it was accurate. I tried. I want you to know that. I drove up when I was invited and I stayed in hotels to avoid being underfoot, and I sent cards and I called on the right days, and I was careful, so careful about every word, and still things would come back wrong. Still there would be months of silence, followed by a Beverly who was polite and a little remote, like she was talking to someone she'd been warned about. The lowest point came on a Sunday afternoon in February. I had driven 4 hours to attend my grandson's 8th birthday party. I had a gift, I had a card, I had taken the whole weekend off work for it. I pulled up to the house and the driveway was full of cars. Music was coming from the backyard. I rang the bell and my son-in-law answered. He looked at me with perfect, pleasant surprise and said the party had been moved to Saturday. Didn't Beverly tell you? He shook his head like it was a shame. She must have forgotten to call. I stood on that porch for a moment. I could hear my grandson laughing somewhere inside the house. I said I was sorry to have missed it, handed him the gift, and walked back to my car. I drove to a Cracker Barrel off the highway, and I sat in my car in the parking lot for 45 minutes, and I cried until I had nothing left. Then I drove home. That was the night something changed in me. Not hardened, exactly. More like clarified. I had been trying to keep peace inside a war I hadn't declared. I had been apologizing for taking up space. I had been small and careful, and still it wasn't working, because the problem was never my behavior. The problem was that he needed me to be the villain in a story he'd written, and there was nothing I could do about that except decide what I was going to build while he kept writing it. I want to tell you about a woman named Harriet Odom. She was 71 years old when I met her, retired high school principal, sharp as a tack, with a laugh that came from somewhere deep and real and a way of looking at you like she was reading the table of contents of your whole life. I met her at my church in Macon. I had started going back to church the year of the parking lot. Something about needing walls around me on Sunday mornings. Harriet sat down next to me one morning and introduced herself, and by the end of the service had somehow extracted the broad strokes of my situation without me quite noticing I was talking. She had that gift. Afterward, in the parking lot, she put a hand on my arm and said, "Evelyn, you have been spending your energy trying to be seen by someone who has decided not to look. Stop. Build something he can't ignore." I didn't know what that meant yet, but I started thinking about it. I had spent 30 years in medical billing. I knew the coding systems the way some people know scripture, backwards and forwards in the dark. I knew where the errors lived and how much they cost. I had watched hospitals and clinics bleed money through billing mistakes for decades, and I had always thought, quietly, that there was a business in fixing that. I had just never had the push to try. Harriet gave me the push. She also, when I finally showed her my business plan 6 months later on her kitchen table, told me exactly what was wrong with it and exactly how to fix it, because she had spent her career running budgets and managing staff, and she was not going to let me walk into something underprepared. I started the company small. Medical billing consulting focused on mid-sized practices in the Atlanta metro area. I worked out of my home office. I had 2 clients the first month. I called in every professional favor I had. I worked early mornings and late nights. I made mistakes and I fixed them and I learned from them and I did not make them again. The business grew the way real things grow, slowly and then all at once. Word got around that I knew what I was doing. By the end of the first year, I had 11 clients. By year 3, I had hired my first employee, a young woman fresh out of billing school who turned out to be sharper than anyone I'd met in years. I gave her real responsibility and she rose to it. By year 5, I had 14 employees and offices in a building I leased in Midtown Atlanta and contracts with clinics across 3 states. I still drove a practical car. I still bought most of my clothes on sale. To look at me, you would not have known what was in my business accounts. That was intentional. I had watched enough people let visible success make them a target. I preferred to let the work speak and stay quiet about the rest. All the while, my daughter drifted further. We spoke on birthdays and sometimes holidays. She was always polite. She had learned his pleasantness. There were years I watched my grandson grow up in photographs posted online by people who knew their family, glimpses of a boy I loved and barely knew. He turned 10, then 12, then 15. I sent gifts that were acknowledged with brief texts. I told myself I was being patient, but patience has a cost. And by the time I was 63, I had paid more of it than I could honestly afford. I hired someone to help me understand what I was dealing with. A woman I'll call my investigator, who came recommended by a lawyer friend and who turned out to be methodical and discreet, and exactly what I needed. I didn't ask her to dig up dirt. I asked her to help me understand the landscape. What had my son-in-law told people about me? What was the version of Evelyn Marsh that existed in that household? What she found was worse than I'd imagined, and exactly what I'd suspected. He had told Beverly over years that I was jealous of their life, that I was critical of her choices, that my visits created conflict, that my calls upset her. He had built a case piece by piece, each piece small enough to seem reasonable, the whole structure designed to make my daughter see her own mother as a threat to her happiness. He had also, my investigator found, said similar things to his family and some of their mutual friends. In certain circles, I had a reputation I'd never been consulted about. There was something else. A former colleague of his, someone who had left the firm 2 years prior, was willing to talk. Apparently, my son-in-law had a pattern. His first wife, before Beverly, had a similar story. Mother-in-law systematically cut out, family relationships managed and controlled. The colleague had watched it happen, and when he'd said something, he'd found himself managed out of his position within 6 months. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't a man who was bad at boundaries. This was a man who was very, very good at control. I sat with all of this for 3 weeks before I decided what to do with it. I could call Beverly directly. I had tried that before, in gentler ways, and it had never worked. He would find out. He would explain it as me trying to cause problems. She would apologize to me stiffly and nothing would change. I needed something different. I needed her to see it herself. The party was in 3 weeks. He had invited me to a room full of people who knew his version of me. He wanted me there to confirm it. I was going to be there, all right, but I was going to be exactly who I actually was. My assistant helped me arrange everything without asking too many questions. She had worked with me long enough to know that when I said I needed something handled quietly, I meant it. A car service for the evening, the kind that made people pause. A dress that was not young and was not trying to be young but was exactly right. I had the suit tailored, plum-colored, because I looked good in plum, and because it was not a color you could overlook in a room. My hair done properly, everything quiet and correct and unmistakably serious. I also brought the documents, not to wave around, not as a weapon, but as a fact. A folder in my bag, my business registration, the most recent contract summary my attorney had prepared, and a letter from a hospital network in Tennessee that we had just signed as a new client, the largest contract my company had ever landed. 42 clinics. I wasn't planning to hand them out. I was planning to be ready. The venue was a converted warehouse event space in Buckhead, the kind of place with Edison bulbs and exposed brick that cost 4 times what it looked like it cost. I arrived exactly when I meant to, not early, not dramatically late, just at the moment when the room was full enough that my entrance would be noticed, but the evening wasn't yet too far underway. The car pulled up to the entrance. The driver opened my door. I straightened my jacket and walked in. I saw him before he saw me, my son-in-law standing with a group of men near the bar, all of them laughing. He looked confident, comfortable, the king of his own room. Then one of the men's eyes moved to the door, and my son-in-law turned to see what they were looking at. And his face did something I hadn't seen it do in 19 years of watching him manage every expression he ever made. It went blank, not blank like empty, blank like every practice thing in it had stopped working at once. Beverly was across the room with a group of women. She turned when she heard the shift in noise, the kind of shift that happens when a room adjusts to something unexpected. And she saw me, and her face went through 3 things in about 2 seconds and then settled into something I couldn't read. I walked to her first. She was my daughter. Whatever else happened tonight, she was my daughter. She looked lovely. She was 40 years old, and she had her grandmother's cheekbones, and she was wearing a dress the color of deep water, and she looked, when I got close enough, a little frightened. I kissed her cheek. She kissed mine. "Happy birthday to your husband," I said, meaning it, because even now I wasn't there to destroy anything. I was there to be real. She said something about being glad I'd come. She sounded like she was watching for something, waiting to see what version of this evening she was in. The dinner went the way these dinners go. Toasts, stories, his colleagues being charming and his family being polite, and Beverly keeping her eyes moving between me and her husband in a way that probably nobody else noticed, but I noticed everything. He came and spoke to me once, early in the evening, perfectly pleasant, asking about the drive, saying he was glad I could make it. All of it true sounding. All of it the performance he'd spent 19 years perfecting. Then his mother made her toast. She was a formidable woman. I'll give her that. She stood up and she spoke beautifully about her son, his accomplishments, the family he'd built. And then she looked at me across the room and she said something about how it was wonderful that he was so devoted to his wife, so protective, that he had made sure Beverly was surrounded by people who truly had her best interests at heart. That Beverly, unlike some women, had a husband who looked out for her, who made sure she wasn't pulled in directions that weren't good for her. She was smiling when she said it. The room applauded. I put down my glass. I stood up. The sound of me standing was enough to shift the room. Beverly's hand moved toward me, not quite a reach, something between stop and help. "I don't have prepared remarks," I said. My voice was level. "I'm just here to say a few true things, since truth seems to be welcome tonight." He started to stand. Beverly's hand found his arm. He sat back down. "I've been described to many of you," I said. "I don't know exactly how, but I have a pretty good idea." I looked at his mother, then at him, then at my daughter. I'm Beverly's mother. I have been her mother for 40 years. And for 19 of those years, I have been managed out of her life, one small, careful step at a time, by a man who is very good at making every step seem reasonable. Someone set down silverware. "I want you to know who I am," I said, "because I think some of you have been told, and I think what you were told isn't accurate. I started a medical billing consulting firm 11 years ago. I have 14 employees. We serve clinics across Georgia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. Last month, I signed a contract with a hospital network covering 42 facilities." I looked at Beverly. I did this while sending birthday cards that weren't acknowledged, while driving 4 hours to a party that had been moved to the day before without my being told, while being quietly, consistently, professionally kept away from my own daughter. Beverly had gone very still. "I am not here to ruin this evening," I said. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here to make a scene. I'm here because my son-in-law invited me, and I believe he thought I would confirm something for these people." I looked at him directly. "I'm here to suggest that they look a little more carefully at what they've been told about everyone he's kept at a distance. I am not the first." I had not planned to say that last part, but it was true, and truth was the whole point. I sat down. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something real has happened in them. He stood up then. His face had found its way back to composed or something that was trying to be composed. He said something about this being a private family matter, about me having struggled over the years, about understanding that it was hard to watch your child build a life that didn't include you in the way you wanted. He was good. I will say that again. He was very good. But Beverly was looking at him, and her face had changed. She didn't say anything in that room. She was not the kind of person to say things in rooms. She went quiet and still, and I knew that quiet. I had known it her whole life. It was the quiet she got when she was adding things up. An hour later, we were standing outside on a terrace. Just the two of us. The city was doing its night thing below us. Traffic and lights and all of it, indifferent and gorgeous. She said, "He told me you called me ungrateful. At my baby shower." She said it without preamble, the way people say things they've been carrying. "I never said that," I said. He said, "You whispered it to Aunt Renee. I haven't spoken to your Aunt Renee since your wedding. She looked out at the city for a long time. He told me you told his mother that you thought I'd married beneath myself. I thought the opposite," I said. "I thought he was remarkable." In the beginning, she was quiet again. "He told me you said you hoped the marriage wouldn't last." "Beverly," I said, and my voice cracked on her name, the first time I'd let it crack on anything all night. "I have a box at home, in my closet. It has every card you've ever given me, every photograph, your first drawing from kindergarten with the purple dog. I have everything. I have never once hoped for your marriage to end. I have hoped every day of 19 years that you were happy, even when I didn't know if you were, even when I couldn't ask." She put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes went bright and then wet. The party was still going on inside. We could hear the music through the glass. I said, "I'm not asking you to do anything tonight. I know this is a lot. I know you need time to think. But I need you to know that whatever you've been told about me, I am still here. I have been here the whole time," she said very quietly. "He moved the birthday party. I found out when I saw the pictures his mother posted. He told me he called you. I thought you just didn't come. I stood on that porch and let that land. He told me," she said, "that you didn't want to be there, that you had made an excuse." "I was there," I said. "I was at your door." He answered. "He told me it was the wrong day." She didn't cry the way people cry in movies. She cried the way people cry when something they've believed for a long time turns out to be a building with no foundation. Quietly and then not quietly, and then with a kind of exhausted relief that looked like grief and was. I put my arms around my daughter on that terrace and I held her and I let her cry, and I didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that the holding wasn't already saying. We stood there for a long time. She filed for divorce 4 months later. I want to be careful about how I tell that part, because it was her decision, not mine. I did not push her toward it. I told her to see a therapist before she made any decisions, and she did. And the therapist helped her see things more clearly than I ever could have explained them, because the therapist was neutral, and I was her mother, and we both knew I wasn't neutral. His control had been more thorough than either of us had understood. There were financial things too, accounts she hadn't known about, decisions made in her name that she hadn't fully consented to. When she finally had access to the full picture, she made her choice. He was not gracious about the divorce. I didn't expect him to be. He tried several things, including telling their friends and eventually her lawyer that I had poisoned her against him, which was nearly funny if you thought about it. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning. Beverly called me that afternoon. She said, "Mom." Just that, "Mom." And then, "I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." I said, "Baby, you got there. That's what matters. My grandson is 17 now. He's been coming to stay with me a few summers, his choice, which still catches me off guard with joy every time. He is serious and funny and works hard at things, like his mother, like me. Last summer he helped me at the office for 3 weeks, filing and fetching coffee and asking more good questions about the business than most adults manage. At the end of the last week he said, "Grandma, I didn't know you ran all this." I smiled and said, "There's a lot people didn't know." He said, "Dad never talked about you like this." "I know," I said. He looked at me for a moment. "I'm glad I know you now. I didn't trust my voice for a second. So I just squeezed his shoulder, the way you do when words aren't adequate, and we went back to work. I opened a second office in Charlotte last spring. Harriet Odom drove up from Macon for the ribbon cutting. She is 81 now and uses a cane she calls her accessory, and she stood in that doorway and looked around and said, "There it is," like she'd been watching for it. I told her she was the reason. She waved her hand. "You were the reason. I just told you to stop apologizing for taking up space." On my desk in the Charlotte office, next to the contract files and the coffee I actually drink while it's still hot, I keep one photograph. Beverly and my grandson at Thanksgiving last year, laughing at something my grandson said. Both of them with their faces open and unguarded, the way faces are when people feel safe. I look at it on the hard days. There are still hard days. 19 years doesn't unknit itself overnight, and my daughter and I are still learning carefully how to be what we always should have been. But we are learning, we are doing the work. And every day that we do it, the distance closes a little. I was Evelyn Marsh. I was called difficult. I was called intrusive, controlling, the mother who couldn't let go. I was managed and maneuvered and slowly shut out of my own daughter's life by a man who was very good at making walls look like choices she'd made herself. I am still Evelyn Marsh. I built something real while he was busy with all of that. And my daughter, when she finally looked with her own eyes, saw exactly who I was. That turned out to be enough. There's a box in my closet that I've never thrown away. It has Beverly's kindergarten drawing of a purple dog, a birthday card she made me out of construction paper when she was 7, and a photograph of the two of us at her college graduation, both of us squinting into the sun, both of us grinning like we'd won something. I kept that box through every year of the silence, through every holiday I wasn't invited to, through every birthday that passed without a call. I kept it because I knew who I was, even when the version of me being circulated in that household had almost nothing to do with the truth. I think about what it actually takes to survive something like that. Not just to get through it, but to come out the other side as someone your own daughter can look at and finally recognize. It isn't one thing, it's 3 things and they work together. And if you're missing any one of them, the other 2 aren't enough. The first is character. Not the kind you perform when people are watching, the kind that shows up at 4 in the morning when you're sitting in a Cracker Barrel parking lot off I-75 crying because your son-in-law answered the door and told you the party was yesterday, and you have to decide, in that car, in that parking lot, who you are going to be about it. I chose not to become bitter. I chose not to spread what I knew about him to Beverly before she was ready to see it herself, because poisoning her against him would have made me exactly what he'd been telling her I was. Character is what you do when doing the right thing costs you something. It cost me years. I paid it anyway. The second is clear thinking. When Harriet told me to stop trying to be seen by someone who had decided not to look, that was the most useful thing anyone said to me in that entire 19 years. It cut through everything I'd been doing wrong. I had been spending my energy on the wrong problem. The problem was never how to make him treat me fairly. The problem was what I was going to build while he kept doing what he was doing. Once I understood that, everything changed. I studied, I planned, I made decisions based on evidence and not on emotion. The business I built came from thinking clearly about what I actually knew how to do and what the market actually needed. Clear thinking is what turns survival into something larger than survival. The third is the refusal to stop. There is no more elegant way to say it. I got up when I didn't want to. I made the calls when I was tired. I drove the 4 hours and I rang the doorbell, and when the door told me what I needed to know, I drove back and I got up the next morning anyway. 19 years is a long time to keep going when the person you're doing it for doesn't know you're doing it. But I kept going, and my grandson now knows where I work. And my daughter calls me on Tuesdays, not because it's a birthday or a holiday, just because there are causes and there are effects, and I've watched both play out slowly and completely. Nathan spent years building something that looked solid from the outside. It was not solid. Things built on controlled and carefully managed lies are never solid. They look stable until one evening on a terrace in Buckhead, when a woman in a plum suit tells the truth in a room full of people, and the whole structure shows its cracks. What you build with dishonesty, you hold together with constant effort, and eventually the effort fails. What I built with the real materials. It's still standing,